So in this lesson, we're going to walk you through installing the SDK to Mac or Windows and doing a basic connect, write, and read to make sure it's running correctly. To install the PHP SDK on macOS, we're going to ask you to use Homebrew, the command line package and dependency management tool. You're going to install PHP 7.1 using the command shown. Because many Mac instances install a system-level version of PHP, you want to be sure to update your path statement as shown or something equivalent to ensure that the local version of PHP that you install is being used here, not the system-wide version. Then you'll install both the C and the PHP SDK. The C SDK is a dependency for the PHP SDK. Once you've done this, run PHP from your course files folder. We have a test script that you can run there. It's just a basic PHP info to make sure that Couchbase is up and running properly as an extension. All of this is described in detail in the workbook. To install the SDK on Windows, well, first get PHP installed if needed, and then update the path environment variable for PHP, and run PHP from a command prompt. The reason to do this is because to select the proper SDK, you'll want to have the exact PHP version, the compiler used to build it, your system architecture, and whether or not thread safety is enabled. Then you'll install the Microsoft C++ redistributable for your PHP interpreter, and then download the Couchbase PHP SDK archive. It contains several files, including libcouchbase DLL, which is our C SDK. You're going to install that to the bin folder on Apache if you're running PHP integrated with Apache, or if you're running PHP standalone, drop it in the PHP folder, not the extension folder, or drop it somewhere where you know that the executables for PHP or Apache as appropriate have access to it. Then you'll install the Couchbase PHP SDK as an extension. Drop it in the extension folder for PHP, and then register it in your PHP INI file. Again, it's all described in more detail in your workbook. Once you've done that, run the test script, again it's just a PHP info, and make sure that the Couchbase extension is running on your system. Once you've done this, we're going to have you run a simple Hello Couchbase script, which you can dig through in more detail. But let's take a look at the 101 on getting documents in and out of Couchbase. So first, our SDKs are consistent across the various languages that we support, so this may be familiar to you from another language. The first thing you're going to do is to create a Couchbase cluster. You pass to it one or more URIs of reliable nodes within your cluster that are used to initially create the object. Now once it's created, the cluster map, as it updates over time as nodes are added and removed from your cluster, is maintained automatically. These are just the URIs for the initial connection. Through the cluster, you're then going to open a reference to a particular bucket. You pass the name of the bucket, and then in a very simple approach to the security, you could pass just a password here if you have a properly configured user account for that bucket. We talk about this more in a later lesson and talk about using authenticators with this process as well. Once you have this bucket, well, the bucket is where all of your CRUD operations as well as your queries are executed. So you create, read, and update, delete documents as you'll learn in the coming lessons through methods like insert, upsert, get, remove, and replace, as well as a query operation that allows you to pass in a nickel query. You're generally, if you're putting something into a bucket, passing a key value pair. In this case, our key is customer AAA123. Notice the double colons in there. We're going to talk about this key convention in a later lesson. And we'll talk about how an upsert creates or updates a document as necessary. The second value here is we have a simple array that gets converted to appropriate JSON for storage. Now what you get back from these methods is a document object, which contains various properties that we'll examine in the upcoming lessons. Here we're just illustrating dumping it. The value that is returned for a get or a query operation you'll find is accessed through the value property of this document object returned as a result. So here we see a simple get operation. You get a particular key and you get this document back, and then you can get the value from that document. So what have we learned here? Well, first, PHP SDK on Mac is installable using Homebrew. On Windows, it is dependent on PHP-specific settings, so you'll get those settings from a test script on your PHP instance and then select the correct PHP archive. In either operating system, you're going to install the CSDK to support the PHP SDK. And we saw that cluster references are created from one or more URIs used to bootstrap the creation process, although the cluster map is updated regularly from that point. We saw also that bucket references are opened through a cluster with security. We'll talk about authenticators later on in this course. Your CRUD and your query methods are then called through the bucket, and a document object is returned exposing metadata to you of various sorts that we'll see in lessons ahead. Specifically though, if you're getting a document or querying for results, it's the value property of these document objects that has the data that you're looking for. In the lab for this lesson, we're going to make sure you've got your PHP server installed, and then install the Couchbase SDK for PHP with all of the related steps we've discussed. And then you'll run a test script for these read and write operations, just to make sure it's all running correctly. Again, the workbook is quite thorough as you've seen, so jump in, do this on your own, follow the workbook, whatever best supports your learning. And then when you're done with that, come on back. We're going to introduce the Slim framework that we're going to use for routing. Very cool, lightweight framework. I think you're going to enjoy working with it, and it's great for use with Couchbase. Come on back.